When 67-year-old Robert heard Whitney Houston's voice through his daughter's bedroom door, he had no idea it would save his 40-year marriage. But that Tuesday evening in November 1994, something happened that would change everything forever. If you've ever felt like giving up on love, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because this incredible true story will restore your faith in the power of music and second chances. Robert Patterson sat at his kitchen table, staring at the divorce papers that had been lying there for 3 days. After 40 years of marriage, he and his wife Mary had finally reached the breaking point. The man who had once promised to love her until death do them part was now ready to sign away 4 decades of their life together. The house that had once been filled with laughter and children's voices had become a cold, silent tomb where two strangers happened to sleep under the same roof. But you haven't heard the most heartbreaking part yet. For the past 6 months, Robert and Mary hadn't spoken more than 10 words to each other. They moved around their modest 3-bedroom house in Springfield, Massachusetts. Like ghosts haunting the same space but never truly connecting. Robert would wake up at 6 a.m., make his coffee, read his newspaper, and leave for his part-time job without so much as a good morning. Mary would get up an hour later, tend to her garden, prepare meals that they ate in complete silence, and retreat to her sewing room. The couple who had once slow danced in their living room now couldn't even make eye contact during dinner. The man who had written love letters while serving in Vietnam now left notes about grocery lists. The woman who had waited faithfully for 2 years while he was overseas now planned her days to avoid being in the same room with him. Their 3 children had watched their parents' marriage slowly deteriorate. What started as small disagreements had grown into long periods of silence, then resentment, and finally complete emotional shutdown. Lisa, their 35-year-old daughter, had tried everything to bring them back together. She organized family dinners that ended in awkward silence. She suggested marriage counseling, which they both refused. She even planned surprise visits with all 7 grandchildren. But wait until you hear what Lisa decided to try next. On that particular Tuesday evening, Robert had made up his mind. He was going to sign the divorce papers the next morning and take them to the lawyer's office. At 67 years old, he figured he had maybe 15 good years left, and he didn't want to spend them in misery. Mary, at 65, had reached the same conclusion. She had already started looking at apartments near her sister's house in Connecticut. That's exactly when something miraculous happened. Lisa had been staying with her parents for the week, ostensibly to help organize old photographs, but really to make one last desperate attempt to save their marriage. That evening, as she went through boxes in her old bedroom, she found a collection of cassette tapes from her teenage years in the late 1970s and early 1980s. As she sorted through the tapes, one particular album caught her attention. Whitney Houston's debut album from 1985. Lisa remembered how much her parents had loved Whitney's music when it first came out. Her mother used to play Greatest Love of All while doing housework, singing along in her beautiful soprano voice. Her father would turn up the volume whenever How Will I Know came on the radio during weekend drives. But it wasn't just any Whitney Houston song that came to mind. Lisa suddenly remembered a specific moment from 1987 when her parents had celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary. They had been dancing in the living room to Greatest Love of All when Lisa walked in from a date. She had watched from the doorway as her father held her mother close, both completely lost in their own world of love and contentment. You won't believe what happened when Lisa decided to put that memory to the test. Lisa carefully placed the Whitney Houston cassette into her old boombox and turned the volume up just enough for the music to carry through the walls. She started with How Will I Know, letting Whitney's joyful energy fill the bedroom. But it was when Greatest Love of All began playing that something shifted in the atmosphere of the house. Robert was in his study, pretending to read while actually staring at the divorce papers and trying to work up courage to sign them. The pen was in his hand, hovering over the signature line, when Whitney's voice began drifting through the walls. At first, he tried to ignore it, assuming Lisa was just listening to music. But as the familiar melody washed over him, something stirred deep in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. I believe the children are our future, Whitney's voice sang with that unmistakable power. Teach them well and let them lead the way. Robert's hand began to tremble as memories flooded back. He remembered dancing with Mary in this very house, holding her close as Whitney's voice provided the soundtrack to one of the happiest moments of their marriage. He remembered how young and hopeful they had felt, how certain they were that their love could conquer anything. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Mary was washing dinner dishes when the music reached her ears. She had been mechanically scrubbing the same plate, lost in thoughts about apartment deposits, when Whitney's voice stopped her cold. The plate slipped from her wet hands and clattered into the sink. But the most incredible moment was yet to come. As greatest love of all reached its emotional climax, both Robert and Mary found themselves drawn toward the hallway. As if Whitney's voice was physically pulling them from their separate corners of the house, they emerged from their respective rooms at exactly the same moment and found themselves face to face for the first time in months. Robert looked at his wife of 40 years and saw not the stranger who had been sharing his house, but the 22-year-old nurse he had fallen in love with at a USO dance in 1954. Mary saw not the bitter, silent man who barely acknowledged her existence, but the young soldier who had promised to love her forever. "I remember this song," Robert whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "Our anniversary," Mary replied, tears beginning to form. "You said it was our song because it reminded you that love was the greatest gift we could give each other." They stood there listening to Whitney Houston's voice fill the space between them with words about love, hope, and human dignity. For the first time in months, they really looked at each other. They saw the lines that time had etched, the gray hair, the careful way Mary moved to protect her arthritic hands. But they also saw something else. They saw 4 decades of shared memories, struggles, and joys. They saw 3 children raised together, 7 grandchildren, a mortgage paid off through teamwork, countless family vacations, hands held during scary medical diagnoses, comfort offered during the deaths of parents. That's when Robert did something that shocked them both. He reached out his hand to Mary, palm up, just like he used to do when he asked her to dance in their younger days. Mary stared at his hand for a long moment, remembering how that same hand had held hers during labor pains, had wiped away her tears at her mother's funeral, had gently touched her face on their wedding night. Slowly, trembling slightly, she placed her hand in his. They began to sway together in the hallway, dancing to Whitney Houston's voice just like they had done 27 years earlier. Robert pulled Mary closer, breathing in the familiar scent of her lavender shampoo. Mary rested her head on Robert's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of the man who had been her anchor through 4 decades of storms. As the song ended, they continued to hold each other, neither wanting to break the spell that Whitney's voice had cast over them. Finally, Robert spoke the first real words they had shared in 6 months. "I don't want to sign those papers, Mary." "Neither do I," she whispered back. "But you're not ready for what happened next." Lisa, who had been listening from her bedroom with tears streaming down her face, decided to take an even bigger risk. The next morning, she called the local radio station and managed to get through to the morning DJ. "My parents are getting divorced after 40 years, she told him. But last night, Whitney Houston's music reminded them why they fell in love. Whitney is coming to Boston next month for a concert. Is there any way you could help me get tickets? I think if they could hear her sing live, maybe they could remember how to love each other again." The DJ was so moved by Lisa's story that he not only gave her 3 tickets to Whitney Houston's concert at Boston Garden, but he also arranged for them to have special seats close to the stage. When Lisa presented the tickets to her parents that evening, they were both stunned. "We're too old for concerts," Mary protested, but Lisa could see the spark of interest in her eyes. "Whitney Houston is timeless," Lisa replied, "and so is your love." The night of the concert, December 8, 1994, Robert and Mary Patterson drove to Boston together for the first time in over a year. They barely spoke during the drive, but it wasn't the hostile silence that had characterized their recent interactions. Instead, it was the nervous quiet of 2 people about to take a leap of faith together. Boston Garden was packed with over 14,000 fans, and the energy was electric. Robert, who hadn't been to a concert since the 1970s, was amazed by the elaborate stage setup. Mary, wearing her best dress, felt somewhat overwhelmed by the crowd, but also secretly excited to be out in the world again. When the lights dimmed and Whitney Houston appeared on stage in an elegant white flowing dress, the entire arena erupted in applause. But for Robert and Mary Patterson, sitting in the 10th row center, It was as if they were the only people in the building. Whitney opened with, "I want to dance with somebody," and the infectious energy had even reserved Robert tapping his foot. Mary found herself smiling for the first time in months as she watched the superstar command the stage with such grace and power. But the moment that changed everything came when Whitney began the opening notes of Greatest Love of All. This is where the story becomes truly unbelievable. As Whitney sang the first verse, she began walking around the stage, making eye contact with fans throughout the arena. When she reached the section where Robert and Mary were sitting, something extraordinary happened. Whitney looked directly at them and seemed to pause for just a moment. Later, they would both swear that she smiled specifically at them. But what happened next had never occurred at a Whitney Houston concert before. As the song reached its emotional bridge, Whitney walked to the edge of the stage and extended her hand toward the audience. "I want to share this song with someone special tonight," she announced to the crowd. "I see a couple out there who looks like they've been loving each other for a very long time." The spotlight swung toward Robert and Mary, illuminating them in front of 14,000 people. Mary gasped and grabbed Robert's arm, but Whitney was already motioning for them to come closer to the stage. "Come on up here," Whitney called out with that warm, infectious smile. "I want everyone to see what real love looks like." Security personnel quickly appeared to escort them to the stage. Robert, his face red with embarrassment, but his eyes shining with hope, helped Mary navigate the steps. Mary, her heart pounding with terror and excitement, found herself standing on the same stage as Whitney Houston. "What's your names, honey?" Whitney asked, her voice carrying through the arena's sound system. "Robert and Mary Patterson," Robert managed to say into the microphone. "How long have you been married?" 40 years this past October," Mary replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Whitney's face lit up with genuine joy. 40 years, now that's something to celebrate. She turned toward the audience. "Let's give it up for 40 years of love." The arena exploded in applause and Mary felt tears streaming down her face. Not tears of embarrassment, tears of joy, of recognition, of remembering who she used to be when she was young and in love. But Whitney wasn't finished with them yet. "Robert," Whitney said, "I want you to hold Mary's hand while I sing this song for you. And Mary, I want you to look at this man who has loved you for 40 years and remember why you chose him." As Whitney began singing Greatest Love of All again, but this time slower, more intimate, like a personal serenade, Robert and Mary found themselves holding hands on stage in front of 14,000 strangers. The bright lights, the massive crowd, the surreal nature of the moment, all of it faded away as Whitney's voice wrapped around them like a warm embrace. During the instrumental bridge, Whitney walked over to them and spoke quietly, her words picked up by the microphone. "Love isn't just a feeling," she told them. "It's a choice you make every day. Some days it's easy, some days it's hard. But the choice to love someone through everything life throws at you, that's the greatest love of all." You won't believe what Robert whispered to Mary next. As Whitney's voice soared through the final chorus, Robert turned to face Mary completely. In front of 14,000 people, with millions of watts of stage lighting illuminating them, he said the words he had said to her on their wedding day 40 years earlier. "Mary Elizabeth Stewart, will you marry me again?" The entire arena fell silent, except for Whitney's voice. Mary looked into Robert's eyes and saw the young soldier who had fallen in love with a small-town nurse, who had written her letters from Vietnam, who had worked 2 jobs to put her through nursing school, who had held her hand through 3 difficult pregnancies, who had danced with her in their kitchen on Sunday mornings. "Yes," she whispered, and then louder, "Yes!" The crowd erupted in cheers that seemed to shake the entire building. Whitney, tears streaming down her own face, finished the song with more emotion than perhaps she had ever brought to it before. When the last note faded, she embraced both Robert and Mary. "You two have just reminded all of us what love really means," she told them as the crowd continued to cheer. But the story doesn't end there. After the concert, Whitney's security team approached the couple and told them that Whitney would like to speak with them privately backstage. In her dressing room, Whitney Houston sat down with Robert and Mary Patterson like they were old friends. "Tell me your story," she said simply. For the next hour, Robert and Mary found themselves sharing their life story with one of the biggest stars in the world. They told her about meeting at a USO dance, about Robert's deployment to Vietnam, about the letters that kept their love alive, about building a marriage through good times and bad, about raising 3 children. They also told her about the recent struggles, the gradual silence that had crept into their relationship, the way they had slowly stopped seeing each other as partners. They told her about the divorce papers that had been sitting on their kitchen table just days before Whitney listened to every word with the same intensity she brought to her performances. When they finished their story, she was quiet for a long moment. "You know what I think?" she finally said. "I think you two never stopped loving each other. You just forgot how to like each other. Sometimes we get so caught up in the daily business of being married that we forget to actually enjoy the person we married." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small notebook. "I want to give you something," she said as she wrote. "This is my personal phone number. I want you to call me on your next anniversary. I want to know how you're doing." Mary started to protest that they couldn't possibly take a superstar's personal number, but Whitney waved her off. "Honey, tonight you two reminded me why I sing about love. You reminded everyone in that arena that real love isn't just something in songs. It's something people actually live." The drive home from Boston that night was completely different from the tense ride there. Robert and Mary talked nonstop, sharing memories, laughing about things that had happened years ago, making plans for the future. They stopped at an all-night diner for coffee and pie, sitting across from each other like teenagers on a first date. "I can't believe Whitney Houston knows our names," Mary said, shaking her head in amazement. "I can't believe we almost threw away 40 years over stupid pride," Robert replied. When they got home at 3 a.m., the first thing Robert did was gather up the divorce papers and tear them into small pieces. Mary helped him throw the pieces into the fireplace, where they made a small but symbolically huge fire. The next morning, Lisa found her parents having breakfast together for the first time in months. They were holding hands across the table and making plans to renew their wedding vows on their 40th first anniversary. "How did the concert go?" Lisa asked with a knowing smile. "Your mother and I," Robert said, grinning like a man half his age, "got engaged." True to her word, Whitney Houston dedicated Greatest Love of All on her next album to Robert and Mary Patterson, who reminded me that true love means choosing each other every day for 40 years. When the album came out in 1996, Robert and Mary received an autographed copy with a personal note from Whitney every year on their anniversary. Whitney would call them. The conversations were never long, but she always remembered to ask about their children and grandchildren, their health, their happiness. She sent flowers when Mary was hospitalized in 1998. She sent a congratulations card when Robert was honored by the school board for his volunteer work. In 2001, when Robert and Mary celebrated their 47th wedding anniversary with a large party, they received an unexpected guest. Whitney Houston, who was performing in Boston that weekend, drove out to Springfield to surprise them. She sang Greatest Love of All in their backyard, while their family and friends watched in amazement. When Whitney Houston died tragically in 2012, Robert and Mary were among the thousands who mourned her passing, but they also celebrated her life and the incredible impact she had on their marriage. At her memorial service, they sat quietly in the back, holding hands and remembering the night that her voice saved their love. Today, Robert Patterson is 94 years old and Mary is 92. They still live in the same house in Springfield, Massachusetts. Their walls are covered with photos of children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. But in the place of honor above their fireplace hangs a framed photo of them on stage with Whitney Houston. Every evening, as the sun sets, they still dance slowly in their living room to Whitney Houston's greatest hits. Greatest Love of All remains their special song, but now they love all of her music because it reminds them of the night their marriage was reborn. The Patterson family has established a small scholarship fund at the local community college for couples seeking marriage counseling. They call it the Whitney Houston Second Chances Scholarship, and it has helped over 200 couples work through their problems instead of giving up on their marriages. Robert and Mary Patterson's love story proves that it's never too late for a second chance, that music has the power to heal even the deepest wounds, and that sometimes a voice from heaven can remind us of the angels we already have right here on earth. If this incredible story touched your heart, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. The greatest love of all really is the love that chooses to forgive, to hope, and to dance together even when the music seems to have stopped. The voice that saved a marriage wasn't just Whitney Houston's. It was the voice of love itself, speaking through music to remind two people that their story wasn't over yet.